There we go. Hello, Joe. It's good to see you.
Hi there, Raffi. Thanks for having me on.
Yes, thank you for joining us. And this is something a bit new. We're trying interviewing other Pokemon YouTube folks. We mentioned this right before we start recording, but I was a big fan of your channel before. I love watching your videos. So it's an honor to get to meet you.
Yeah, thanks, I guess. And like I said, it's mutual. I've really enjoyed what you guys have come out with already. So it's cool to get involved in it.
I'm so glad. So I suspect that most of me and Jake's audience is people who are primarily into collecting, and this will be a nice window for them to learn more about the actual game that you can play with the Pokemon cards that they put into slabs and never shuffle again. And people like myself who sort of dabbled in both. I love both collecting and also was a player for a while. And so I want to primarily just ask you about your experience being a player. We'll go through each of these questions in order, but the overview is like, how did you get into it? What do you love about it? What makes the Pokemon trading card game unique as opposed to games like Magic or other ones that people might be familiar with? And then how does that cross over with collecting? Like, are you also a collector? And how does being a player and keeping up to date with the metagame like inform your buying and selling decisions? So to start with, tell me about yourself as a player. Like, how did you first get into Pokemon? How long have you been playing for?
Okay, so outside of the usual like playground story, when I was like 5, 6, 7, I got back into it when I was like 14, 15. Just a random day, wanted to buy some packs, feeling nostalgic, I guess. And the latest set at the time was Diamond and Pearl Legends Awakened. And I bought, I think, like 2 or 3 packs. I managed to pull an Uxie level X. And for those of you who don't know, it was like the best card in the format at the time. And I didn't know that either when I pulled this card. I literally looked at the card, saw that it was a level X card, and thought, this is unlike anything I've ever seen before in my life, because I had just been used to WotC stuff. So I got to researching, and it just so happened to be the best card. And that, because it was such a good card, just your usual Google searches led me towards the playing side of the game. So I kind of started to look at decks and all that sort of stuff, and it's kind of snowballed from there. So kind of started around 2009, something like that. Because I was only 14, 15, and there wasn't really a league or anything around me for like an hour or so, I didn't really go to many events per se until around 2014, 2015. So for a good number of years, I was only really playing with 1 or 2 friends, and just basically looking at stats of recent tournament results and YouTube content and other people. So that was really my into Pokemon. I think that's also why I got involved in the YouTube side eventually, was because that was really what kept me in the hobby for those like 2 or 3 years when I had no physical friends in the game, I guess. But yeah, from like 2014, 15, basically as soon as I could drive, I was going to a ton of tournaments. And for the last 4
Did it
years, I've
feel,
been a
was it like
world
a big
competitor.
shift to, sorry, was it like a big shift to go from playing casually to like competitive? Or, I mean, does it feel like a different experience?
So, I mean, I was definitely a slow developer because I had that big gap where I was basically only playing against 1 or 2 people, and it was basically my skill level against X person's skill level. We were keeping up with articles and all that sort of stuff, so we were pretty in tune with what was good. And just for like reference, the first tournament I entered in 2014, I actually won. So like I wasn't terrible, but I definitely feel like from 2014, I definitely progressed a lot as I started to go to a lot more tournaments, got to meet and play against better players. So naturally, that sort of drive definitely pushes you on in leaps and bounds. But I would have preferred like a league around me, because then that I could have been better a lot earlier, I guess. But yeah,
Yeah. And you mentioned that you've been a world's competitor for the past 4 years.
yeah.
Um, so, so what is that experience like? I mean, do you have to, like my experience, just what I know from the world of Magic, where I'm not a competitive
Hmm.
player, just a casual player,
Hmm.
but you have to like grind, right? Like you've got to go to all the local events, rack up points and wins before you get invited to the Pro Tour. Is it similar in Pokemon?
Yeah, it's very similar. There isn't anything like a Pro Tour. So you can enter any level of events you want to, but Worlds is the only one that's exclusive. So every season you can go to some grassroots tournaments. They're called League Challenges and League Cups, where you can get a small amount of championship points. They're normally, around 50 or so player tournaments at times. Then you have a step up from that, which is specials and regional events. There's probably well, in the US, there's like about 20 of them a year. So every 3 or 4 weeks, there'll be a regional or a special event for people to play in, sometimes even less. And they give out a higher level of points. They normally have around 400 plus players, 400 for Europe, maybe towards the 600 to 800 amount of US Masters all playing in one thing. That's Masters is the highest age division, which is like 15 and up, I guess. And then 4 times a year, there will be international tournaments. So there's one that happens in America, one that happens in Europe, one that happens in Brazil, and one that happens in Australia. So there are 4 big internationals every year. That started in 2017. It was a big mix, switch up of things, because previously it was just national tournaments and then the Worlds. Now they've sort of integrated it a lot from 2017 onwards, where there were these big 4 tournaments that you could go to. So that really gave people an incentive to grind a lot more, because you can get free travel awards to these 4 destinations. And I don't know about you, but I hadn't been to Brazil, Australia, or even America before those sorts of tournaments started happening, which is really, really cool. But it all sort of culminates at Worlds, where if you reach a certain level of points over all of those tournaments combined, you can play in day 1 of Worlds. And if you did very, very well, like if you were the top 16 of the US or the top 22 in Europe on the rankings, the championship points that you earn for playing in these tournaments, you could get an automatic entry to the 2nd day of the Worlds competition. And after the 2nd day, basically the winner's crowned on the 3rd day, where it's just the final. So yeah.
Nice. And so this is a lot, I imagine, for people who haven't played the game since they were kids, right? And I think this is how I associate it, with just like Pokemon. The card game was very simplistic, involved a lot of card flipping, pay to win, right? Like whoever the Charizard or the Blastoise. And I was similarly surprised when I came back years later, I don't know, 15, 20 years later, to see that like it was extremely strategic. In some ways, I like it even more than Magic. It feels like in some ways there's even less variance than Magic. And so can you give our watchers right now kind of an overview of like how the game is different from when we were kids, and the ways in which it involves strategy?
Okay, so when we were kids, I feel like the best deck was Haymaker. And really, instead of like, the biggest thing to know about Pokemon compared to other TCGs is there's nothing like mana or anything like that. The real core is energy attachments power up your attacks, and you're only able to attach 1 energy per turn. So you're trying to have a back and forth, dealing damage to them with these attacks, with the amount of energy that they require, and you're trying to take prize cards to win the game. So it's quite different to most other card games, I would say, because naturally these energy cards, they suck. They're like basic lands, but they're in your deck the entire time. So like it really adds a clunk factor to the game. So it means the drawing element of Pokemon is super, super different from most other card games. For example, in like Yu-Gi-Oh, Pot of Greed is a draw 2, and it's banned because it's too good. Whereas in Pokemon, you can play 4 copies of a card that lets you draw 7. And it's just like, it's a good card, but you can play without it and still be good. So it's a very different card game in that regard, because you can push into your deck and dig for certain pieces a lot of the time. But it's very much a back and forth of trying to launch attacks at one another. So yeah, it does play quite differently. Kind of Hearthstone-esque, where you're trying to oftentimes have control of the board by knocking out your opponent's biggest threats before they knock out your stuff. But you don't need to deal life points or face damage, anything like that. You're just trying to deal with the Pokemon in front of you, basically. And it kind of mirrors the video game, where you have 6 Pokemon. They kind of mirror that in the card game, where there's 6 prize cards, and certain Pokemon give up a certain number of prize cards for what they are. So yeah.
And one thing you said is what I loved about the game when I rediscovered it, right? You can basically draw through your entire deck over the course of the game. It's like decking out is like a common way to lose, as opposed to Magic, where it's very uncommon. And I liked it a lot, because in other trading card games I played, or just other strategy games in general, you can build a whole deck and craft a whole strategy and never really get to see it play out. Whereas in Pokemon, my experience was like 9 games out of 10, I would be able to execute my entire game plan.
Yeah, it's a very different element of RNG, really. Depends. It feels like a lot more fair RNG, just the feel of it, because you see such a high proportion of your deck. Like Hearthstone games can often last like 6 minutes. Yu-Gi-Oh is often like 3 turns and it's over. It's like a long game. Pokemon can be, sometimes 8 turns. I think in the last couple of years, we've got down to like 5-turn games being the average. But there's certainly been eras of the Pokemon trading card game where it can be 9 and 10-turn games is the norm. So you have a lot of room, a lot of wiggle room to play and sort of show how good you are, which is good.
Yeah. I want to address something that kind of bothered me, and for people who are watching who play the game, it's probably similar, and just power creep, right? It's a problem that every sort of TCG faces at some point if you decide how to deal with it. I'm not a Yu-Gi-Oh player, but what I've heard is that basically they're just like unabashed power creep year after year after year, and they intentionally make the best cards extremely rare and therefore very expensive. So I guess from your experience, like, does Pokemon have power creep, and how, if any, has it changed over the past few years?
Yeah, so unlike Magic and Yu-Gi-Oh, they have a rotation every year, which really helps slow down power creep. Power creep's certainly been a thing. Like, you can't play a deck from 4 years ago and expect to beat a deck from today. Like, that just won't be a thing. But in terms of the game's pacing, it's kept in check quite a lot because the cards that we use that sort of keep you in the game, let you draw cards, do all those things, they cycle out every 2 years or so. So they keep a good flow of the game throughout, because otherwise, if we just had the full card pool available to us, everyone would be like Yu-Gi-Oh, where it could be a combo deck. You could draw your entire deck at once, etc. So they've done a good job at cycling out cards. They have a very, very restrictive ban list, so they don't really touch any cards, which is a good thing. But I think in the last couple of years, like tag team Pokemon, they have way too many hit points. VMAX Pokemon have way too many hit points. So there's certainly power creep, and it's obvious every company needs to make money. They need to make you buy the new set, right? So they have to power creep to some extent.
I guess that was my frustration, was even within the current rotation, right? Like the EX Pokemon, they just, each new set, they had an average of like 10 hit points more. And it was like, why, right? There's no reason other than like, you have to put the newest cards. But I agree in general, I think they do a good job. But like in Magic, there is a rotation, right? So the main format that people play, standard rotates, pretty consistently. But in Magic, there's also older formats where you could basically play with the entire card pool, from a certain date onward. Does Pokemon have formats like that? And if so, are they played at all?
So they have an expanded format, which is black and white on, but that's basically exclusively played in the US, and it would be a handful of their regional tournaments. And it's down to the discretion of the people who run the League Cups and League Challenges, what format they want. But I would say most of the time it would be standard. So standard is the golden child, and some people like to play expanded. But because we're going back to sets, quite a number of years ago now, it's not always that accessible for new players, and I think they are quite conscious of that. So standard is definitely the main method of playing Pokemon, and every Worlds format will be in standard. It's never been anything else. So yeah.
Yeah, and I get the sense that the Pokemon Company does make an effort to draw people into more competitive play, like cards that are staples that everyone needs, right? So for example, Shaman EX was very expensive. That's around when I was playing. But then when Tapu Lele was kind of like the new Shaman, that everyone needed in their deck, they printed like a Walmart, Target box that had a guaranteed Tapu Lele in it. And like recently, like I think Dedenne GX, they include in like one of the pre-constructed decks, right? So I'm getting a sense that in general, the like box sets, the pre-constructed decks are getting better over time and making it easier for new players to build decks that are like competitive in the sense that they're just as consistent as you'd want them to be to have that same type of gameplay that's strategic.
Yeah, I would say Pokemon probably has the lowest barrier to entry financially of like almost any other mainstream card game, because there are plenty of tins, like tin promos. Theme decks are slowly getting better. They're still lagging behind a lot of other things. Like Yu-Gi-Oh theme decks are really, really powerful, but Pokemon theme decks sometimes have a handful of helpful cards. And they've recently brought out products like the Pikachu and Zekrom and the Reshiram Charizard like battle decks. Those are excellent for new players to pick up. That gives you a lot of cards that could be the basis of one of the strongest decks currently in the game. So they do keep costs very, very, very low. And I think that's because this game is still, directed to kids for a lot of the time, even though the main player base is probably an average age more similar to us. They still market towards kids, and they still want kids to be able to play the game because that's what keeps the game alive at the end of the day. So it's not surprising that they keep the barrier so low compared to everyone else.
And so that gets to this other question. Like if you are someone who's around our age and you're looking to get back into the game, maybe you already have cards in a collection, but nothing that's necessarily competitive or modern. How would you get started? Like what would be your first few steps?
Well, research is similar to, buying old cards. The first thing you want to do is research, I would say. There are some great websites out there. Limitless TCG is a fantastic resource that you can look at to see recent tournament results. And you can literally just get deck lists right then and there of pretty much everyone who had a decent standing in the tournaments, which is phenomenal. They even give price breakdowns of the deck. So it's absolutely an awesome resource people can use. Over the last couple of years, there's been, a good number of people streaming all the time, good number of YouTube channels out there that can help you, get you at least looking at relevant archetypes in the game. And then it's down to you to start learning the rules and learning how to play. But I think Pokemon has always been a very easy entry-level game to learn. And then there's always that second level of thinking about the game. And then it becomes much more difficult and much more precise. But as an entry-level player, it's quite an easy game to get into, I would say.
Nice. And I would personally put in a plug for the online version, right? Like Pokemon has made a pretty excellent client. Yeah, PTCGO, Pokemon Trading Card Game Online. That's exclusively how I played when I was playing. And I found that the price point was like very, very reasonable, especially compared to Magic Online. I don't know much about Hearthstone, but basically like I could build the 3 best decks in the meta at any point, spending less than like $30, right, on the code cards, and then just trading for the cards I needed.
Yeah, it's quite different to Hearthstone, and I think also to Magic, because PTCGO doesn't really have an in-game currency. You have to buy the code cards that you would get in packs, and then you have to do the physical trading yourself. But in terms of price, if you are just buying those code cards and using those as trade bait, you can make 1 or 2 very, very good decks, like you said, for $30, $40, $50 or something like that. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've touched on sort of what the keyword here, which is finances. And so I'm curious, before we get into the finances of the cards, right, just finances of your lifestyle. I've always been curious, right, like a tournament player, my understanding is I think you have a full-time job, right? So how do you handle a full-time job and playing competitively? How do you pay for traveling to all these exotic locations every year and pay for the cards you need?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So almost every Pokemon player has a job outside. That I could probably count on one hand the amount of players who are, I am a full-time Pokemon person as a standalone player. So it's quite different to some other card games and esports and stuff like that. We're a long ways away from that. But I would say I spend a good amount of time playing the game, and it's where I like to kind of dump my money, I guess flush my money down the toilet is the modern era of cards. But yeah, most of my disposable income, I would say, goes towards Pokemon or travel and all that sort of stuff. One good thing about tournaments is if you are decent enough at the game, they do have decent amount of prizes that you can earn to recoup some of that money. And also, like I said, there are those travel awards. So if you do get into that high level of tournament play, you can have a travel award to some of the more glamorous destinations. And at the end of the day, you can still get to the World Championships just doing local tournaments. You can just grind out League Cups, League Challenges, possibly only attend 1 or 2 regionals. And if you're a decent enough player, you can still make that World Championships. And then that's just one big expense. So there's that sort of, there's 2 kinds of people. There are people who just try and hit that bar for Worlds and they're happy. And then there are those people who are going to every regional all the time to try and either get into that day 2 automatically, or they're trying to get travel awards and stipends towards those things. So I think since 2017, Pokemon have done a pretty good job at recuperating some of that capital that you spend into the game just for travel and Airbnbs and stuff. But to keep costs low, it's always good to have a friend group who you can travel with. I love Airbnb. It makes things so much easier. And normally I'm in groups of like 5, 6. So it has a good sense of camaraderie. It's a lot of fun just to be amongst those sorts of people who are like-minded as you. And it also keeps costs down. So that's definitely helpful.
Yeah, definitely. And how much are you involved in like buying and selling, right? Could you, 2 questions, I guess. Could you, right, like say, okay, I'm going to sell my current deck right before it sort of phases out of the rotation or even just phases out of the metagame to basically recoup most of the cost of buying a new deck? And part B, if it is possible, is that something you typically do, a lot of buying and selling?
So I'm probably an exception to the rule because I am just a straight hoarder. I want to have every deck accessible to me, and I basically never sell. But I think a lot of other people, they will stick to a deck for probably a whole season or 2 decks in the whole year. And then as those cards adapt and new sets come out, you just sort of make tweaks as you go, either because a new deck has come out and you need to adapt, or because there are cards that can help your deck and you add those to your deck to make it more powerful. So if you do want to play, I've had plenty of friends who have just had one deck and tweaked it across the whole season. And we're talking like $100 for a year of play with one deck, which is really, really easy. And, before rotation, you can try and sell off as much as you can. The one thing I would say is there's always a massive wave of cards entering that market all at once, because as soon as rotation is announced, everyone is clearing out their binders, throwing it away as quickly as possible before it just drops. Because as you'll know from the likes of the Shamans, the Lele's, in the future it'll be the Zacians and the Dedenes, they will tank immediately. And from a collector standpoint, for those sorts of cards, you can happily wait like 2 years and then just, when it rotates, pick up the cards then. As long as you don't want PSA 10s, that sort of stuff, you should be fine. So
right, and I'd say, that's like the opportune time for a collector, right? Is like my advice to any collector who's also interested in collecting modern cards is like, wait a couple of years, just wait until they're out of rotation, because you'll see some cards that seem so randomly expensive, even if it's a Pokemon that's not particularly cool or desirable, chances are it's being heavily played in the metagame. And vice versa, I think part of what makes Pokemon nice and very affordable to be a player is that a lot of the cards that are unplayable are still desired by collectors. And so part of the expected value of a booster box is driven by collectors, and if you're willing to sell it, right, you can sell those cards.
For sure. Yeah. So that's one thing that's really strange about Pokemon, especially as sets have got larger. There's probably only like 10% of cards that are actually useful in gameplay. And there are tons of just filler cards that are basically just for collectors. And the actual player base has a minuscule impact on prices. I think it's exactly those cards that need to be in every single deck where you see a big bump up of prices. So it's a very, very small proportion that players actually impact anything, because we basically always just buy singles. So yeah.
Do you have any sense of like what percent of the purchases of like packs are players versus collectors?
I mean, I couldn't give you a real value, but just from what I know about the friends that I've made along the way, almost everyone will buy singles. And a lot of prizing is a combination of cash and booster boxes. Booster boxes almost always get sold to the vendors at the event. Some people rip them open, obviously, for a laugh, but I would say most of my player friends don't collect, or if they do collect, it will be 1 or 2 sets maximum, I would say.
Yeah, that makes sense too, right? Just it's different markets, which I think helps both sides of it. So I want to ask a question about the game and maintenance of the game from the company. I know Magic has been going through a lot of controversies recently about issues with power creep and other announcements related to competitive play. What do you think is the most like controversial decision that the Pokemon company has made in the past couple of years that might have divided or angered the players?
It's a good question. I think power creep is a concern, and there are a lot of people that hark back to golden eras. And I think especially since lockdown, a lot of people have gone back to times where it's, they're more fond of. And I think there is a small concern there. So I think, whenever a new mechanic is introduced, there's always some skepticism. Like tag team Pokemon gets a lot of heat because big basics is always hated on. And I think a lot of the time people want to see evolving because it's such a natural thing in the video games. And as a part of Pokemon's philosophy, the fact that almost always the best decks in the format are just big basics. A lot of people are not happy with that. So I think
is it the case that like early in the GX area, evolutions made a comeback, and like the GX Pokemon, a lot of the good ones like Decidueye and stuff were GXs?
GXs were an absolutely loved mechanic because all the best stats were on evolving stuff. And we'd just come out of that era of the second wave of EXs, the capital EX era. And they had dominated. They'd absolutely dominated tournaments, worlds, all that sort of stuff. There was a very specific few evolutions that actually worked. And GXs were so strong that you had to play evolutions for the most part. For my own personal player experience, I actually prefer big basic formats because it's more consistent and everyone gets to play and it's less RNG based. But people who just like evolving their Ralts into a Gardevoir, they love the GX era. It just puts a focus on specific trainers, and then you have to hit combination pieces, which makes the RNG quite harsh because you're either doing nothing or you're doing everything because you got your evolution off. So GXs were a pretty okay mechanic. I enjoyed the fact that a lot of stage 1s were very good. That had a decent flow of gameplay. But the biggest problem with evolving in the trading card game is that the player going first has such an insane advantage because you were jumping from something with 60 hit points to 200, all in the difference of one turn. So the player who got to go first just like immediately wipes something out in front of them, takes a prize card, gets hand advantage. Like Pokemon really can snowball without comeback mechanics because taking a prize card makes your opponent play more cards. It's more resources that they have to find and use. Whereas you're getting card advantage because a prize card literally goes straight into your hand for you to use on future turns. So Pokemon inherently, the win condition is snowbally. So there needs to be a lot of comeback mechanics put in check to make that okay. So Evolutions really did put an emphasis on the player going first. So yeah, that was the only real problem of Evolutions, I would say.
Yeah. I'm curious about some of your favorite decks. I mean, I can go first. This is back in the day, right? Like a few years ago. But I played the expanded format online. I loved Flareon Vespiquen, right? Attackers that like power up the more Pokemon you have in your discard pile. And so turn 1, just try to get like 20 Pokemon in the discard pile with Battle Compressor. I found it's a little bit more solitaire, which I think probably lends itself better to online than in person. Like in person, I'd want to have more interaction. Online, I'd rather just do turn 1, see if I can basically set myself up to win the game or not, right? And it was kind of like a cool puzzle. I think Night March was pretty similar to that too. And then my other favorite deck was the Trevenant lock, right? Try to get a Trevenant on turn 1 so they couldn't play items. It's just I have more fun when my opponent can't do anything.
Right.
How about you?
Typically, I like playing aggressive decks. So, funnily enough, the Revenge stuff, the Flareon and the Vespiquen, those are the two of the decks that I've had the best performances with. The first cities I ever won was with Flareon. The first regionals I ever won was with Vespiquen. So I like dumping stuff into the discard pile, cycling through my deck, and just getting down to that size where even if your opponent disrupts your hand, your deck size is so thin that you basically only have outs to win the game. So I think that's something that's quite different with Pokemon as well. You have 60 card decks, so filtering the jank out of your deck is like a big mini goal throughout every game that you play. And those sorts of decks really did that very well. But I mean, in that sort of era, I was playing a lot of Seismitoad, which was also a lock deck where you stopped your opponent having resources. I played a lot of Vespiquen in that sort of time, a lot of Yveltal. So yeah, I will basically play anything if I think it's good for a tournament. So I never really stick to like one deck. I'll always look at the metagame, look at what's popular, look at what I believe has good matchups in those sort of circumstances, and then get comfortable with the deck and start playing that a lot. But then for the next tournament, I'll give it a fresh pair of eyes and just say, these have what been doing good in the last couple of months. What am I going to bring to that tournament specifically? So I've never really stuck to one thing. I've always bounced around to win the event rather than just like, this is the best deck in the game. So I've always kind of tried to be adaptable.
Yeah. And how about right now? Like what decks are you currently playing?
I'm playing Turbozation at the moment. It's basically a deck that I created, which is cool. And it actually won like the largest tournament that we've had online just recently. It was like a 1,000-player tournament, which is cool.
It won like you or someone using your deck idea?
Someone was using the deck that I sort of like popularized, I guess, which was fun. But Turbozation now is like seen as one of the stronger decks. Zacian was definitely the strongest card to come out of Sword and Shield as a Pokemon. It was previously combined with Arceus, Dialga, and Palkia, the sort of tag team card. But in Rebel Clash, we got this thing called Scoop Up Net, which lets you pick up certain Pokemon, which lets you reuse certain abilities. And it meant that this previously really fringe, meme combo with Jirachi Prism Star now became like a real deal great combination. So Turbozation is doing well only recently, and is like a brand new deck. But I absolutely love playing that because it combines like being aggressive, being consistent because you're all basics, but then also you have this internal struggle against yourself of trying to sequence correctly to try and make the most out of this little gimmicky combo like that you have going on in your deck, which is really cool.
That sounds so fun. I'll have to get back into it. Ever since my kids were born, I haven't had much of a chance to play online, but I'm hearing good things about the like the current format?
It's not bad at the moment. I think the real indicator of something like a healthy format is when there's like 5 or more decks that are viable. So it's not really rock, paper, scissors. There's good sort of versatility in the format. So I like formats where there's, you know, between 5 and 8 decks that could realistically take down a tournament on any given day. And at the moment, we're in that spot, which is really cool.
Yeah. I'm looking at the time. We have about 5 minutes left, and there are 2 other things I wanted to ask you about.
Okay.
So first one is about collecting, and second is about YouTubing. So I guess besides for hoarding your modern cards and keeping all your decks available, are there any, do you collect sort of vintage cards, WotC era cards? Do you collect PSA cards?
Yeah, all of the above, actually. When I got back into it in 2009, as well as sort of starting to dip my toe in competitive, it was immediately me going back to my childhood cards that I did first. So I've actually opened a booster box of every WotC set other than Neo Destiny and Neo Rev. So I've opened pretty much everything in WotC. I fortunately, because I was watching a bunch
getting
of...
back into it, you bought a booster box for the experience of opening it?
Yeah, and that was, and I opened all of those. So I could have been sat on a gold mine, but I wanted to open them at the time. And I mean, this is back in 2009, 2010, 2011. So all of these boxes were like the low 100, 200 kind of mark. So I've been really, really fortunate that I got the nostalgia bug maybe 6 years before everyone else. But it's meant that, yeah, I've got a very, very nice binder collection that I love. And
did you get the cards you opened graded?
So I'm actually in the process of that now. I've graded maybe like 200 cards like 4 years ago, something like that. And I've recently, over the last like 2 or 3 months, because prices have gone wild, I've finally seen the incentive to grade a bunch of my cards. But I've, you know, sleeve top loaded, protected everything very, very nicely. A bunch of the cards that I did grade like 4 years ago, a decent number of them got 10s and stuff. So I'm pretty happy with what I've got. And I've sent off like 400 cards in the last like 3 months because there's finally an incentive to.
And you're finally willing to part with them, to sell some of them?
I mean, it's mostly so that I fill my collection goals, but additional spares I'll sell. So yeah. And basically so the box craze happened at like 2009, 2010, 2011 or so, but I was still quite young back then. I was like 16, 17, 18. So I didn't really have much income. And then like, now that I've got a job and stuff, I've just been picking up the PSA cards to fill the gaps. So I'm trying to fill out those sets. My overall collection goal, I guess, is to complete the WotC set holos in mint or better.
In PSA, like PSA 9 or 10?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Nice.
So yeah, there's actually a video on my channel of my like progress of those cards. It was like a year ago, but yeah, you can dig that up if you want to.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
So my last question is related to your channel. Basically,
mm-hmm.
You know, I'm sure that people are familiar. We'll link to it in case they aren't. But if someone did want to get into creating YouTube videos, like I found it a really nice way to just be connected with other people and hear their thoughts and have conversations online. So let's say a hypothetical friend named Jake or Raffi who wanted to start a YouTube channel related to something Pokemon and become, you know, relatively successful to the extent we can build a community. What's your advice?
Well, for what you're doing, I think discussion-based videos are very good, and it's definitely a hot topic right now. So for me, I've never really tried to chase views or viewers or anything like that. I've just been recording what I've been passionate about and documenting my journey along the way. And I think people connect to you as a person and like to see how you get on and what interests you. And that genuine love or interest really does shine through, and it's just so natural that as long as you're doing what you're happy recording, that's going to be the best policy. So yeah, I've been doing YouTube now for like 6 years. And basically it's just been documenting the journey along the way. Like if I had pushed for more views here and there, if I'd clickbaited or whatever else, the channel would be bigger, but it's not my goal. It's just I've wanted to show my experience along the way. Part of the reason why I started doing YouTube videos was actually just a spot when I was making mistakes, because I was recording deck battles and stuff like that. And there were times where I couldn't figure out why I'd lost a game. And then you go back and think about how you could have done things differently, and it helps you improve. So a big portion of why I started doing that was actually just for my own personal reasons.
Yeah.
So I'm not really the normal kind of YouTuber where you're trying to hunt those views and subs and all that sort of stuff.
Which I think people
Just
appreciate.
a side product. Yeah.
For sure. And
I think
that's
it's
part of the
good.
reason
I think
like
it's
it.
good. Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're about to run out of time. So I want to say
That's
thank you
fine.
so much. I love speaking
Yeah.
with you, learning more about you, and hopefully we can do this again soon.
Yeah, I'd love to, honestly.